Hello friends, welcome back. I am Jason and it is frosty this morning. It's about 20 degrees, I would guess. Hard to say. It's what it feels. It feels pretty cold. Yesterday was surprising when it was actually snowing hard. Felt quite warm. And I could have been outside in a t-shirt. It felt like it was kind of odd feeling. Humidity, I guess. Who knows? But anyway, look at all these footprints. What critter has been here and took a whiz right there? This morning, what happened was everything kind of melted a little bit after it snowed yesterday, and then it froze overnight, and now everything is crispy and frozen and cold. And as the weather warms up just a little bit and all of this starts to kind of melt a little bit, that is a cold situation, because if you get wet in this type of situation, oh man, you will freeze your butt off. Right now, it's actually, as long as you're moving and active, it's not too bad. But if you were to get wet at all, as this snow starts to melt from overhead, that is going to be a cold situation. So being able to get a fire and maintaining a fire in a situation like this is going to be pretty important. And it's important to get out and practice doing it, because if you have never practiced doing it, making a fire in this kind of condition right here, then you're probably going to fail. So you should probably get out and actually attempt to do this to see if you can make it happen when it really matters. Right now, I'm pretty cold. I've only got 2 layers on. I've got a long sleeve shirt underneath this hoodie right here. Both wool, by the way, which is smart, because even if it does get wet, it'll insulate me. I've got wool long johns on over underneath my pants, and wool socks. So pretty much everything I'm wearing is wool, my wool base layers. Now, if I was to sit still, let's say I was hunting or something like that. Let's say I was, stationary for a long period of time, or perhaps maybe worst case scenario, I got injured and I couldn't move. That would suck. That'd be bad. I'd get cold pretty quick dressed the way that I am right now, because like I said, it feels like it's about 20 degrees, give or take. So assuming that I'm not injured right now and I've got the basic supplies on me and I'm dressed semi-appropriately, I should be able to make do. So I've got a knife on me right now. Now, yes, it would be nice if I had an axe or a machete or a larger blade of some sort, heavier duty blade, where I could chop down some big, large, standing dead tree, and I could split it down to get to the inner wood fibers of that wood, and it would make fire lighting easier. But that's not always the situation. Maybe you just don't have that for whatever reason. Who knows why? It was stolen by a pack of rabid squirrels. I don't know. But I don't have an axe. I don't have any of that. I've got a small knife right here around my neck, and I've got a lighter in my pocket. And a lot of people say, don't trust a lighter because it doesn't work in cold environments. If you put the lighter in your pocket, you've kept it in a warm environment and it works just fine. So it doesn't really matter how cold it is outside, as long as you keep it warm next to your body. But anyway, Bic lighter is always my go-to. Some people prefer ferro rods, but the problem with a ferro rod is you need tinder, and you can't always find dry tinder immediately wherever you are. Sometimes you have to make it, and sometimes you have to dry it out, and sometimes it takes time, and sometimes we don't have time, or we just don't want to waste the time. So having an open flame, a ready-to-go lighter like a Bic lighter, I just don't understand why that's not everyone's preferred way of doing it. It's definitely my preferred way of doing it. So that's what I suggest. And then another thing, around my Bic lighter, I've got some people call this a ranger band. It's an inner tube. It's a bicycle inner tube that I've got wrapped around my Bic lighter. And that is super handy for a couple reasons. One, it makes it like tacky, rubbery. It won't fall out of your pocket. So if you're laying down, the slick lighter, the plastic lighter, won't just slide out of your pocket very easily. It kind of stays in there. It's kind of glued in there a bit. And then the other thing is I can take that off. I can burn the entire thing, or I can cut it into strips, and it will burn for a long time. And everything is wet. Everything is wet. Like I said yesterday, it snowed a bunch and it started to melt. And because it started to melt, everything got soggy wet, and now everything's frozen, which is even worse because now you're dealing with stuff that has actual water, frozen water on all the branches and all the twigs and all the stuff that you're trying to burn. So having something like that is going to be really, really helpful. So let's say I need to get a fire going now because I'm starting to get a little bit cold. I'm starting like I am right now. I'm a little bit shivery, a little bit cold because I'm not moving around very much. What do I need to do? I need to gather kindling. Since I have an open flame, I can skip past the tinder phase. I don't have, it would help, but I don't necessarily have to have tinder. I can skip it because I have an open flame. I've got a backup ferro rod in my belt, but I don't need it. So what I'm going to look for is these broken, or not these broken, but these branches, these small little twigs that are off of the ground attached to an evergreen tree, such as this white pine right here. These are by far the go-to, my favorite source of kindling. They work the best, they light up the fastest, they're the lightest, driest wood typically, and they're these really small little twiggies right here. That's going to be really helpful for getting my fire started. So as you can see, they're all covered in snow and frozen ice. It's frozen. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see if I can get zoomed in on there. So everything's covered. Everything's wet. Everything's frozen. There's ice. You can't feel that, but I can. It's slick. There's ice on top of this wood right here, but that's okay. It just takes a little bit extra processing. So what I'll do, basically off this one tree right here, this one pine, small pine, I can get just about everything I need to get my fire started. Not maintain it, but to get it started. If it's not frozen ice on the branches, sometimes you can just smack them against the tree and get a lot of the snow off. But in this case, the ice is still on there. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of extra work, and that's okay. Just break off all these branches. I'm not processing anything yet. I'm just breaking off these branches. And I've got this big bundle now, this big bundle of branches, and I'm gonna get several of those. Let's pick out where we're gonna have our fire. Now that's important too. And I have attempted to have fires in snowy conditions before. I camped out one time with just what I had in my pockets, basically kind of what you see here. Camped out one time and it snowed 6 inches on us overnight. I had this lean-to primitive shelter, you know, just stuff I made with my bare hands. Lean-to shelter, got a fire going luckily. And then it started to snow a lot, like 6 inches overnight. And what was happening is the heat from the fire was melting the snow overhead, and it was dropping huge, big clumps of snow down on top of my fire and putting it out several times, and I had to stoke it back up. Luckily, I was able to keep it going all night, but it took a huge amount of effort. So you got to be careful. Overhead, look above you. Where are you starting your fire? Is there a big tree above you that's holding a lot of snow? Yeah, just like in the textbooks, the survival handbooks, you get up underneath a tree, you know, and you're sheltered from the elements overhead because the tree is just naturally protecting you to some degree. But look at this tree behind me, like this holly, for example. This one is covered in snow. If I was to build a fire underneath this tree right here, the heat from my fire would melt all this snow overhead and it would all fall down on top of me, getting me wet, getting my fire wet, and perhaps putting it out completely. And that would be bad. So what I would try to do is look overhead and look for a situation maybe where there isn't something overhead holding up a whole lot of snow that's not going to drip up. I mean, even way up, if there was a tree way up there, that heat from your fire goes way high and could potentially melt some really big clumps of snow above you. So just look over your head and see if there's a clear spot, you know. Maybe it's not ideal. Maybe you got to deal with maybe there isn't any situation where you can get away from that. Maybe it's just inevitable that you're going to be building your fire in a place where there's going to be snow overhead. And that just might be the way it is. And I've had to build shelters for my fire before. I've had to build like lean-to shelters for a fire, which is super irritating and a lot of work, but sometimes it's just what you got to do. So I would pick myself a spot where a deer has scratched this spot out. This actually wouldn't be a terrible spot for my fire. A deer has already cleaned this out for me. But overhead, you can see there's quite a bit of cover and there's probably snow over there up above me. So maybe that's not the best spot. So we'll pick another spot that's a little bit clearer overhead so we don't have falling precipitation on us from the heat of our fire. Try to keep your stuff off the ground if you can. Like you kind of can wedge it up in a tree, you know, up off of the ground just a little bit. That sometimes helps as best you can. There's no perfect situation here, but this looks like a pretty decent spot. Nothing really overhead. And what I'll do is I'll just clear the snow from this spot. The ground is all wet. There's no avoiding that because, like I said, it all melted yesterday and then froze back. So there's not much we can do about that, but I can do the best I can to give myself a drier spot. Now, you may be in a place where there's feet of snow, and you might have to dig way down to get to actual ground. That's going to be a different scenario. I don't have a whole lot of experience in places with tons of snow. I'm a Southerner. I've been in the South just about my entire life. Well, I've lived in the Southeast most of my life, and I've lived in Southern California for about 8 years. So I don't have a ton of experience. You guys can chime in. You people that have, you Canucks that have a ton of experience with really, really deep snow, you can talk about your strategies and how you make that happen. But here, a foot of snow is probably about the max that we're ever going to get. I mean, it's really rare to get more than that. This is pretty typical, you know, just a few inches of snow and it lasts a few days and then it melts, but it's always wet, cold and wet. It's always best to get all the stuff you need to get your fire going before you even start. You'll sometimes feel like you need to hurry up. Like I've been in situations before where I've been really legitimately very cold, much colder than I am right now. And it's kind of a nervous feeling. It's kind of a hectic feeling, like you feel like you need to scramble. And in some ways, that's okay because it warms your body up because you're moving fast, you know, which is fine as long as you're not hurting yourself, slipping and falling, making careless mistakes. That'll be okay. But you do need to gather up pretty much all your supplies, all your materials before you light that fire, because you don't want to get a flame, get it all going, perhaps use up all the tinder or that little inner tube that I've got, the Ranger band. Use all that up, expend it all, and then have your fire go out on you. And then you're screwed, right? Unless you've got more. But nobody has time for that. Nobody wants to waste their time, especially if they really need a fire. So here's the second clump of branches I've got off of a pine tree. That's the second pine tree. So I'm gonna lay that right here with the others, just like that. Now that's probably enough to get my fire started, but I'm gonna go get one more bundle just like that. All right. Okay, that's plenty of kindling to get my fire started. And now what I want is to get a little bit of fuel. Again, I haven't even started to light this thing. I could light it right now, but I'm not going to. I want to get a little bit bigger fuel before I start. For that, I'm just going to look for some dead standing stuff like this right here. See how the bark's gone off that tree? Big long branch. That is perfect. This is going to be nice and dry, dead, and about the right size, you know. I'm going to get everything from like finger size fuel all the way down to arm size fuel, and that's perfect from this one branch right here. This is all I'm going to need to get my fire going, obviously. Oh, and here's another one. Here's a dogwood, dead standing dogwood. That's going to be perfect. All right here close by. It's not laying in the snow. I mean, sometimes you got to do what you got to do, and your pickings might be slim, but you just have to process it more if that's the case. This stuff is still frozen and covered in ice, so we'll just have to do the best we can. So I mentioned tinder. This is poplar bark just hanging in the wind. Feels reasonable. My fingers are really numb. I'm not wearing gloves. I typically don't wear gloves that much unless I need them. And I'm intentionally not doing it now so I can simulate, you know, having cold, wet hands. Dead poplar branch right here that's covered in snow. All this bark, possibly on the bottom side, might be usable. We'll see how wet it is. But that's a jackpot right there. You know what? I'm not even going to use that. I'm going to leave that and come collect it at a later date. I'll use this right here, but I'm going to come collect all that at a later date because that's a jackpot. That's a lot. We use that for future fires. We don't even need it today. Oh, look at all this ice. See that? Covered in ice. It's completely frozen. Okay, so I'm just still moving my body, warming my body up. Perhaps I'm a little wet, but by moving, I'm going to be drying out a little bit as long as a lot of wet precipitation is not falling on me. But again, that's why wool is important. An outer shell, a waterproof shell, is not a bad idea either. As long as you're not sweating and adding a whole lot of moisture from the inside out, that's kind of a bummer too. The waterproof layers, Gore-Tex layers, I've got real mixed emotions about them because of that problem right there. Even the Gore-Tex, but when it's wet, it doesn't breathe very good. It breathes okay when it's not wet, but that's not when you need it to breathe. You need it to breathe when it is wet. So the wool has been pretty amazing. This stump right here, I don't know for sure. Haven't really cut into it, but I'm guessing this stump probably has quite a bit of pine resin in it. So I'm just gonna knock that down and I'm gonna put it over here. Yeah, I'd say that's got quite a bit of pine resin in it. So I'm just gonna put it over here. I'm just gonna lay it down first. I'm gonna start my fire around it. And if it catches on fire and it's got a lot of resin in it, awesome. If it doesn't, no big deal, but I'm pretty positive there's a reason why it hasn't rotted completely away. So we'll start our fire right on top of that. So I've got a whole huge pile of teenies here. And then I can make some in-betweenies, as I like to call them, teenies, in-betweenies, and bigs. These would be my in-betweenies, like finger-sized stuff. And then these bigs is what I can use to sustain my fire once I get it going. Now, I process stuff as minimally as possible. Only do what you gotta do. I don't like to spend a whole lot of time making pretty feather sticks and all that stuff if I don't have to. If I need to, then I'll do it. Like in this situation, I don't think I'll need to because these tiny little branches here are fairly dry because they've been up in the wind and drying out, and there doesn't seem to be any ice on here. If I couldn't find anything that was completely dry, everything was wet. Let's say it was raining. Like yesterday, it was like freezing rain. Really nasty. If that was the situation, I would have to cut away some of this bark. So like, for example, what I would do if that was the situation and I couldn't get away with just the tiny little twigs and all I had was stuff like this that had ice all over it, is I would take my knife. Hopefully I've got one. I would take my knife and use the back of it. You can use the blade too, but just save your edge if you can use the 90-degree spine. And I would just scrape off the ice. Like literally this has got ice on it. So I'm just scraping off that ice and getting rid of that outermost layer of moisture. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100% dry, but it's drier. It's a significant difference between this and this right here that's still got water on it. And then if I wanted to, I could just make some really crude feather sticks. And this is how I do it. Some guys make like these beautiful curls, you know, these really long curly feathers, and they look really nice. And it looks cool on your, you know, your Instagram photo like that, you know, these really beautiful curls. But for the most part, that's really not necessary. So what I do is I just do this. I just cut in there, I curl it up, and I make a whole bunch of these right here. These really crude, ugly looking feather sticks. And this is what I'm gonna use to get my fire started if everything was really wet. If it was actively pouring down rain on me right now, or freezing rain or snowing, I'd have to protect this in some shape or form so this doesn't get wet. So that would be important. But what I would do is I would make myself a whole bunch of these little feathers, just like this. I'd make about, generally speaking, about 20 is a good rule of thumb. That's what I found to be successful. Anything less than 20 of these in really wet conditions means that it's going to burn up. It's not going to be hot enough. It's not going to have enough flame to dry out the rest of your kindling. And then your fire is going to go out and you're going to fail. So I would say about 20 of these sticks right here is, generally speaking, pretty good if you need to do that. Don't always need to do that. So I just did that here, and I'll just do the same thing on this side. They don't have to be pretty. They can be ugly. Oops. Try not to send them flying into the snow. And these leftover twigs, these sticks, these are excellent ones to build whatever's left. I can't make any more real good feathers out of here. I guess I could make some little ones. But I could use these leftover twigs that are too small to work with, and I could use those as my base for my fire. But that's a good one there. And let's pretend we couldn't find any good tinder like this. I mean, this is decent. It's a little damp. Probably won't burn that great anyway until it has a chance to dry out in the sun or something. So we'll just save that for later. Just getting the ice off, scraping the ice off my sticks, making some ugly feather sticks. That wind is kicking up now. The wind is cold. A Scandi grind is excellent for this kind of stuff, man. It's hard to beat a Scandi grind on a knife for that kind of feather sticking, for a carvings type work. I really do appreciate the Scandi grind for that. Just carve away until it gets small. Try to catch it before it flies off into the wet, like that. And just take your little feather stick, stick it on top of there. I very much appreciate a neck knife in the wintertime too, when you got a lot of layers on and you gotta dig through all your layers to get to your belt. Neck knife is pretty handy for that. Wintertime, the neck knife really shines. And now, what I need to do is just continue making a little bit of a bed. This ground is super wet, really wet ground, very cold. So what I need to do is to make myself a little bed for my fire. So with these frozen sticks here with the ice on them, I'm just gonna scrape that ice off, scrape the outside bark off these sticks, and just lay them down to give myself a nice little bed. All nasty, wet, frozen stuff here, but it'll work. Not ideal, obviously, but it is what it is. So I've got my 20 feather sticks here. That's gonna be plenty, I think, to get my fire going. Just finish this bed up. Doesn't have to be much, just needs to be big enough to keep your initial kindling off of the wet ground, because when you start that fire up, that heat is just gonna be kind of drawing that moisture out. And it's gonna really struggle if you don't make some sort of bed for your fire. None of this has to be pretty. Just get most of the bark off, most of that wet bark, frozen wood, just scraping off the outside as best I can. Kind of like that. Like so. So now there's a significant difference in warmth between this right here and this right here. That is cold and wet. This is warm and dry, warmer and drier. So now we're gonna pretend that I do not have this Ranger band on my lighter, and I'm not gonna use that. This would be really helpful. And if I was really concerned about my well-being, I thought there's a chance that I'm gonna freeze to death tonight, then I would just go ahead and use that, or at least part of it. But we're gonna pretend that we don't have that because we've prepared our fire lay, our kindling properly. We shouldn't even need it. Since the way I laid this on here, all the teenies are at the ends. So I can basically just bundle it up like this and snap it off. Yeah, and there's ice. There's ice all over this stuff, but it's just, sometimes you just got to deal with what you got. It's small enough to where I think we're going to be okay. Definitely got ice all over this, but I think we're going to be all right. So now I get myself a bundle like this, and I kind of squish it and twist it up a little bit because I want it to stay together. I don't want it to fall all over the place and loosey-goosey. You need your fire to breathe, of course, but you don't want it to be so spread out that the flames from each of those twigs that's catching on fire doesn't hit each other. You want it to share. You want those twigs to share the warmth, share the heat. So you want kind of a bundle that's kind of tight like this. Yeah, definitely cold and wet, but sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. So moving down my bundle, it's getting a little bit bigger. So that's my kind of in-betweenies, and that's what I want next. So same deal, and I'm just gonna sit this right here next to my fire. And we're getting a little bit bigger as we move down. Got some littles mixed in there, some teenies mixed in, and that's fine. There we go. So I've got my feather sticks here that are nice and dry. I've got my teenies right there, really tiny little pencil lead size twigs, a little bit bigger in-betweenies right here, ready to go on the fire. And I've got my bed. I've got more to throw on that whole bundle right there when it's ready. And then I've got some larger fuel right here that's covered in ice. And you can knock a lot of that off by beating it on the tree or something next to me. But if you stack your firewood, what I like to do is I stack my firewood up close to the fire. So as that heat starts resonating around, starts spreading around, it's starting to dry out my firewood that's around that fire. So that's kind of what I do. It's kind of my setup. I build a big wall of firewood right here. Obviously, if I was going to spend the night here, I'd want a whole lot more than that. I'd want, generally speaking, I need a pile of firewood at least as big as me. That's the minimum if you want to last the night with a small little fire. Minimum. A firewood pile as big as me. I'm 5'10", 180 pounds-ish. So that's what I would want. But this is enough for demonstration purposes. That's enough for, you know, an hour or so. So I'm using this dead pine here as kind of as a lean-to, as a prop up I could just use a stick, like any old stick. I could jab it in the ground kind of at this angle right here and then lay my kindling on top. And what that does is it creates a space for my baby fire to breathe a little bit. But in this situation, I can just lean everything against that dead pine log. Got a little snow on it, but I think it'll be okay. So I'll take my bundle of feather sticks here, and I'll just get a few of them ready to go like this. I'll lay these down kind of like that on my bed. The heat's always going to rise up, so I'm kind of positioning these down right there, and then I'll just loosely set these on top like that with those curls kind of all in a jumble right on top. Again, you don't want stuff spread out too far because that heat, they won't share the heat. You want your fire to share its warmth with its friends around it. So now that I've got that set up, I'm ready to light this thing. So I'll just light the bottom with my lighter. You could do it with a ferro rod. You just have to make really, really fine feathers. And that's, not necessary if you carry a Bic lighter that's in your pocket all the time. So I should be good to go now to light this thing. See how much moisture is in this. There we go. Trying to mess around too much as I demonstrate here. So that's burning. Now here's my teenies, and I'm gonna go ahead and hold those over right here. I'm not gonna set it on just yet. I'm just gonna hold it over until all those feathers kind of catch up. And that heat is rising up through my teenies here and drying everything out, which is crucial. And then once those start to catch, you can tell when they start to catch fire. Then you can lay it down gently without squishing anything. And sometimes you got to give it a little air, but it's windy right now, so I don't need to do any of that. And then what I'll do, again, some people like to wait until the flames get above what you're burning. I don't really do that, to be honest with you. Everybody has their own way. What I do is I like to put it on there pretty early, just gently, because I want that heat to rise up through it and start drying it all out. So I'll just loosely, very loosely, lightly set it on top of there. And that heat from my initial flame is going to start drying out my kindling. And to me, that seems to work really well. Again, 1,000 ways to skin this cat, but this seems to work good for me. So now our kindling's on fire, and that's excellent. That's what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and take my next bundle, this big bundle of the bigger ones, like finger size stuff, and I'm going to, with ice all over it, and I'm going to gently lay it on top. So those flames can start drying it out. I've got it kind of bundled up, not tightly, but semi-tightly, right? Not all just spread out, all loosey-goosey. I'll start busting up this smaller stuff, the fuel, and I can gently start throwing that on there. I know it's got ice on it. I know it's covered in snow, but it won't matter because I had enough. The volume of my kindling is enough to dry this out. If you start with this little skimpy pile of twigs, you're gonna fail. You gotta have volume in your kindling. More is not always better, but in this situation it is. You can't really have too much. So all this icy covered branches that I found off of the ground, not on the ground, I can start laying on there. And if it's too big, a lot of people, I see this all the time. People are always getting their saws out, their axes out, and they're cutting their firewood up into a million little pieces, into like firewood size stuff that you'd put in a stove. I don't do any of that. I don't see the need. I mean, I don't understand why people waste a lot of time cutting their wood up into tiny little pieces. You don't need to. What I would do is, let's say this is too big or too hard for me to break, right? Or I didn't have a saw, or even if I had a saw, I would just lay it across like this, and I'd let the fire burn it in half, And then I just feed the ends in after it burns in half. There's no need to bust some of this stuff. This is covered in ice, but it'll be okay. It'll be okay. There's no need to saw that in half. I'll just lay it on there like that, nice and long, and I'll have my firewood going long ways like that. I'll burn it in half, and then I'll just start pushing the ends in like that, or I can set it on again in the middle and it'll burn in half again, and let the fire do the work for you so you don't have to. That's a big one. Don't waste time chopping and splitting and sawing when all you can do, well, all you need to do is just get the fire going and let it work for you. I uprooted this whole tree. But again, I don't have a saw. I'm not gonna cut through this with my knife. I don't have an axe. I'm not gonna chop it. I'm just gonna lay it on the fire and let it burn. Let it burn in half. That's it. I could just stick the end in there if I wanted to, but I'm just gonna let it burn in half so it's more manageable. And as this stuff right here burns in two, it's hanging off the edge, just throw it on top. And then as it burns, those coals will fall down and continue to work, and continue to burn up. And if I was in a bad spot, I was really cold, this would be amazing. And sometimes shelter's the priority. Sometimes you need to build a really, really good shelter to get yourself out of the rain, the freezing sleet, or whatever. Sometimes just getting a great big, gigantic fire is all the shelter you need. Fire is shelter. It's creating a bubble of warmth, this little microclimate around you that is your shelter. You step away from it, a step away from that fire right there, and it's cold and windy. I step back towards this fire, and I've got this security, this shelter right here. So fire to me, I don't know. There's always the argument, shelter versus fire, which one's more important? It kind of depends. But being able to start a fire, a significant fire, a sustainable fire in a short period of time with minimal supplies, regardless of the weather, regardless of the climate, that is huge. If you can't do that, that's your next mission. That's what I challenge you to do. Go out in the next day when the weather is absolutely terrible. When you think to yourself, ugh, I'm not going out there. That's when you need to go out, and I want you to get a fire going like this one. Now, I'm not saying this is the absolute worst conditions to start a fire in. It's not absolutely terrible. Yesterday would have been way worse, but I was having too much fun with the family, sledding, and I was pulling the kids. I had a rope attached to the e-bike, to the two-wheel drive Birch bike, 750 watt motors on the front and back, and I was pulling kids in an inner tube on it in the snow. It was fantastic. So I was busy. I have priorities, just like everybody else. And as those coals start to form down there, it's going to be less and less important the quality of firewood that you're throwing on there. As the base gets hotter, you could throw on some pretty crappy stuff that's pretty wet or semi-rotten like this. I could probably throw that on there and it would catch eventually. It would dry out and burn for me. And you know, it's always good to have. Sometimes what people do is they get their fire started and then they have this great big pile of jumbo firewood. But you really need kind of a combination to maintain a fire all night sometimes. Sometimes you need some littles, some teenies to get your fire stoked back up. Because let's say I curled up here. I made myself some sort of bed on the ground here where I wasn't laying in the snow, some insulated barrier between me and the earth. Let's say I did that and I eventually fell asleep because the warm fire felt good and I nodded off. And I wake up, my fire's out. I might need some additional teenies here to get my fire back to life. So don't just get your fire started and assume all you need is big stuff. That's not really the case sometimes. You need some the whole spectrum, smalls, mediums, and larges, teens, in-betweens, and bigs, to keep your fire going. That feels good. So maybe now that I've got my fire going and I've collected more firewood, I've got plenty to last me through the night. I get settled in for the evening, and maybe what I do is I'm just planning on sleeping here by this fire, and I'm just gonna lean up against this tree. That's my plan. So what I would do is I would kick this snow away like this, and I'd make myself a little spot to sit down where the snow's not gonna melt and get me soaked, like that. Kick away most of the snow, like so. And then I'll just build me a small little place to sit that's dry. And let's say I don't have any equipment. I don't have some sort of ground pad or anything like that. I'm just gonna make one real quick, and I'm gonna use these pine boughs right here, these evergreen boughs, to do that. Lots of ways to skin this cat. I could sit on a log or something like that, but that's uncomfortable. That sucks. These evergreens are gonna be the ticket. Get a whole bunch of it. The stuff that's still green. Shake off the ice, shake off the snow as best you can. Now, if this was just a dry snow, it'd be great because you could just shake it and you'd end up with dry needles here. But because of the freezing rain and melting, freezing conditions, everything holds on to that moisture, which sucks. So yes, you're gonna get a little wet. Just collecting this stuff, you're gonna get snow on your shoulder. I probably have snow on my head. But it is what it is, right? I mean, you try to do your best to stay dry. You try to do your best to get yourself a warm shelter. But inevitably, stuff's going to get wet. So it's just the best you can do. And in some situations, maybe the best you can do is just kind of do the dance around the fire all night to generate body heat and to stay warm, because that's what's required of you. Hopefully you're fit enough to do so. But it'd be really nice to have a comfortable spot to sit down. So here's a dead branch. This will be good. Right here. That's perfect. So I'll just bust this up to a size big enough for my butt to go on. If the ground is not the shape or slope that I want, I'll fix it. I will modify. Give myself a little place to sit my butt. Like that. Nice. There's dead sticks, and I just lay them down just like I did for my fire. Just something to keep me off the ground. Like that. Like so. Any nubs sticking up, probably want to get rid of those. And let's get a few more. I take my pine boughs, and I can just stick them in the ground, the pointy ends. I can just stick them in the ground around my sticks here, my bed. Stick the pointy ends in at just irregular angles all over the place, like that. If they're a little long, you can split them off, like that. So all my leafy bits are right here where my butt's gonna go. Little icy. I could potentially dry some of this out over the fire before I sat down on it. That wouldn't be a bad idea. So now I've got a nice little spot to park my keister. This snowy part right here. Snowiness right there, get rid of that. That I'm gonna lean up against. Whew. Dust it off. I could put some more right here, but I think you guys get the point. Stack that up right there. And now I can sit my butt down on this much drier, much more insulated, softer seat and lean up against this tree. And perhaps I've got my wood pile. I'd have my wood pile right here next to me. Imagine that's it. Have my wood pile here, have my fire right in front of me. And I could maybe even, if it was really windy, I could build up a shelter around me to protect myself from the wind, or have some sort of cover overhead, a little lean-to shelter if I needed it. Or perhaps I'm exhausted, wore out, and all I could do is get myself this fire, have myself a little something to sit on right here and rest until the sun comes up. Okay, friends, thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate all of the views. All of the comments are greatly appreciated. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. I'd be very appreciative of that. And until next time, what's the worst that could happen? Let's just go on 3.